So this time around, I want to create another database function that will allow me to search for availability, not for a given room, but for all rooms. And as I suggested last time, one of the things we want to do with this is to return not just whether or not there is availability, but to return the actual rooms for which there is availability, if any, for a given date range. So the first thing I want to do before I go any further is, if you look at the function name for the one we did last time, search availability by dates, that's actually search availability for dates by room ID. So let's change the name of it and change it here, by room ID. And then of course we'll have to go back to our repository and change the name to by room ID. And then back in our handlers. There'll be a mistake here somewhere, probably, if we called that. No, we haven't called it yet, so we're good. So just to fix that up, to make the function actually describe what it's going to do. Now let's go look at our database structure and think about this. So this is dbeaver, and I'm looking at the bookings database, and let's go to the public schema right here and look for public and tables, and let's look at room restrictions. So I'll bring that up by double clicking on it. And it takes it a moment to list the columns for some reason, but there they are. So one problem I see immediately is that there are going to be two kinds of blocks or entries that are permitted to go into this table. One is for reservations, and that's no problem. We already have that one working, so it puts in the start date, end date, room ID, reservation ID. But the other kind will be where there's no actual reservation, but we're going to allow the property owner to close rooms on certain dates because the owner's going on vacation, or because the room is being closed for maintenance, or whatever the reason might be. But the room is not available for certain dates, even though there's no reservation. And the problem that I see here is that reservation ID, which is this column right here, if you look at the actual restrictions for that, reservation ID has not null, which means it has to have a value in there. And because there's a foreign key on that particular row, you have to have an entry in there that corresponds to a reservation. And that's not possible because in some situations there is no reservation associated with it. So there's two things I'm going to do. The first thing is I'll go to restrictions and I'll put another row in here. So I'll open this up. And I'll go to data, and I'll put in a second entry. So let's add an entry. Down here, find the plus button, and we'll call this owner block, which is as good a name as any. Nobody sees it except for us anyway. And the date will be 2020-11-19, 2020-11-19. Okay, so let's save that. Okay, so now we have ID of 2 for owner block, and that's the one we're talking about. When someone enters a restriction for a given room for given dates with an ID of 2, we don't actually need the reservation ID. So I need to change this column under room restrictions, which is right here. I could just uncheck this for restriction ID, which I believe is this row, or for reservation ID. I could just uncheck this and click save, and we'd be good. But that's actually not helpful. The next time I destroy my database and bring it back up by running soda reset, I'd have to go manually change that again. And chances are I'm not going to remember that, and then I'll be banging my head against the wall trying to figure out why something doesn't work. So instead, let's go back to our IDE and open our terminal window and make sure we're right in the right directory, and I am. And let's generate a new migration. Soda generate fizz add not null to reservation ID for restrictions. That's close enough. So it creates the migrations for me, and I will go down to my migrations right here and find that new migration and find the up. And what I want to do in this case is change a column. So I can just say change column, which is right in the Fizz documentation or the Soda documentation, but it's very simple syntax. Change column. The table I want to change it on is room restrictions. And the column I want to change is reservation ID. And it's still going to be an int, so I'll put integer. And this time I want to put in null true. And I think that will do it. So let's open up our terminal window and find out. Soda migrate. And there it is. So now we should have a not null. So if we'll go back to dbeaver, and hopefully it'll refresh this. Sometimes I have to take 2 or 3 tries. Yes, there it is. Now it is not null. That means now it is not null, which means I'm allowed to enter a null in there. So when I enter a reservation or enter a restriction for a room that happens to be an owner block and not a reservation, I can just not specify reservation ID, and by default it will be null, and that's fine. So that solves that problem. So now I have both restriction types that I need. Now I have the ability to enter a restriction into room restrictions without a reservation ID. So now let's get back to our actual query. So I'm going to hide this window and open up Postigo, just because it has an easier to read SQL window. So I'll open my bookings database and I'll open an empty query window. Now what we're going to do this time is very similar to what we did last time, where we were looking for availability for a given room for a given date range. But this time I want to get more than just a true or a false, or the number of rows that exist in the room restrictions table. This time I want to get the room ID, because I'm going to need that, and the room name, but only for available dates. So I know I need the room ID and the room name, and those exist in the room table. So I can type select, and I'll put this on another line, and I'm going to use an alias, r.id, r.roomname, from the table rooms with the alias r that links it up here, just to make it more readable. And I need a where clause. Where, and here's the part where I can actually get where I can determine whether or not the rooms are available. And it's very similar to what we did last time, but this time we're going to use a subquery, which you've not seen before, but it's not that difficult. Where r.id, the ID from the rooms table, is not in, and the syntax is just not in, and then you have a subquery, and the subquery is just another query. So what I'm going to do is almost identical to what I did in the last query we wrote. I'm going to say select room ID from room restrictions, and I'll call it RR just so it's readable, and I can put an RR here, rr.roomid, so that gives me my alias, where my start date, and I'll choose 2021-02-19 because I know that's going to be available, is less than RR end date, exactly the same as last time around, end date, and my end date, 2021-02-21, is greater than RR start date. And then I have to close my parentheses. So if you think about what's happening here, is I'm saying, get me all of the IDs and room names from the rooms tables where the ID that's in the room table is not in whatever this query returns. And this is looking for room ID in the room restrictions table using the same syntax we did last time to determine whether or not something is available. So when I run this, I get both rooms are available. But if I look at my room restrictions table to find out what exactly exists as a booking, I have a reservation from February the 1st of 2021 to February the 4th of 2021. So if I go back to my SQL query and change this to say 2021-02-02 to 2021-02-03, I should only get one available room. And I do. So this query works. So what I'm going to do is copy this query, the entire query, and go put it in my IDE and write the function to make this search work, because this looks like it's going to do exactly what I want. And close this, and close this, and find our Postgres and create a new function. Func, and this again will have the receiver of Postgres DB repo, and this one I'll call search availability for all rooms. And it's going to take a start and an end, which are of time.time. And this time I don't need the room ID because I'm searching all room IDs. And what it's going to return, well, what is it going to return? I'm going to get the room name and the room ID. I could return 2 ints and potentially an error, but it seems to me that it's probably more useful to return a slice of models.room and an error, if any. All right, so let's first of all get our query in here. Query is assigned the value of, and I'll just put it in backticks and paste in the query that I have, which I'll fix up in a moment. Let's go get our context so I don't have to retype this thing. Paste it in here. And now let's clean up our query a little bit, just so it's more readable. And I'll just move that over. There. Now we have a query. And I'll put this on its own line. And there. Now everything will fit nicely. Okay, so there's our query. Now, what do we want to do? We want to do exactly the sort of thing we did last time, except we're not going to be querying a row context. We'll be querying the context because we're potentially getting more than one row, which means I'm going to get a result that I don't care about, an error that I do, and that's going to be equal to m.db.queryContext, pass it the context, pass it the query, and pass it any parameters we're going to use. And we're going to use 2. So we'll pass in start and end. And now we'll replace these with our placeholders, start and end. Okay. Then we check for our error. If error is not equal to nil, we're going to return. We'll return a variable I haven't declared yet, which I'll call rooms, and our error. And up here, let's just declare that variable, var rooms, which will be a slice of models.room. Okay. So once we've done this, once we have our that shouldn't be ignored, that should be rows. What does query row context return? It returns rows. So I actually want the rows here. No, I don't want to ignore the result. I need something to look at. So for rows.next, what am I going to do? I am going to say, just like we did up here, anywhere we look for our rows, here we had, actually we didn't do it in this one, but we did it in this one, connect to PG. We can look exactly at how we did it in get all rows. We say for rows.next, and then we scan for our rows. So we can scan for that. Let's go back to here and say rows.scan, and I want to scan it into a particular destination. So what am I going to scan this into? Well, I'm only getting 2 things. I'm getting my ID and my room name. So I can say, I got to first of all declare a variable, and my variable will be var room, which is a model, models.room, not reservation, room. And now I scan into it. So I'll scan it into, let me just put it over here, room.id, because I'm selecting a ID, and I'm going to scan into room.name, room name. Now I have this variable, room, and I need to put it into my slice, which is of named rooms. So I can just say rooms equals append rooms, and then I'm going to append the value room. So I now have this slice. So I need to do some returns. Return rooms and nil. But I want to check for errors, just like we did over here. So after we did our scan, we actually put that into a variable error. So let's go back into this and say error is assigned the value of this, and if error is not equal to nil, what do I want to do? I want to return, I'll return the variable rooms, we're going to ignore it, and my error. And again, just as we did over here, once we did our actual check for our actual scan in the for loop for the rows, we also checked to make sure there was an error one last time. So here, we can do that right after the for loop. And we don't want to log here, we want to return our error. And I'll do the same thing, return rooms and error. So now I have this function. Let's just format it to make sure it all looks good. Let's give it a comment. Search availability for all rooms returns a slice of available rooms, if any, for given date range. There. Now I need to put this in my repository. So let's copy this whole thing, go back to our repository, and add this. Let's make sure everything compiles. So I'll clear the screen, run. Everything compiles. Perfect. So now we're in a situation where we can actually begin to hook up our search availability screen to the screen where we can actually make a reservation. So we'll do that in the next couple of lectures.